That's it. Good evening. Welcome to Rowan. What's this? 14, 13, 14,
Yeah, this is
15,
official number 13.
13. Yes. Welcome to the show tonight. Something very cool. You can see him on the screen already. Eeben Barlow. We've been asking for a while, and he's been gracious enough to join us on the show. So, guys, welcome to the show. Rowan, please introduce Mr. Barlow to our listeners.
Yeah, good evening, guys. Welcome to Weekend Warrior Podcast. We've had a little bit of a break, but yes, they say life happens. It is my big pleasure to introduce Mr. Eeben Barlow. I was contemplating how do I introduce the man, but it's a difficult thing to do. I think if you're from the Borderwar generation, the name, there's no introduction needed. If you're a war buff, there's no introduction needed. If you've read any book about warfare in Africa, I do not need to tell you who Eeben Barlow is. So I'm just going to tell him to introduce himself.
Okay, guys. Rowan, thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me onto your show. I'll try my best not to swear, number one. Number two, I will just say, that a lot of guys who were in the border war, there were so many people up there that, it's impossible to know everyone and to have worked with everyone. I think ultimately, though, to introduce myself, I'll just say I'm a second-hand soldier. I have written a few books. I've served in a few countries, and as officially part of those armed forces, and I'm about to publish a new book. So, as an introduction, really, that ought to serve. Just further than that, I was born in Zambia. So, sorry, my phone has gone off. I was born in Zambia and educated in what was then Botswana land, now Botswana. And then we came to South Africa, where I became a naturalized South African citizen. So, I think I know a little bit about Africa. I know a couple of the people in Africa, and I feel comfortable in Africa, and I feel very comfortable that what I and my men do are actually doing good for the continent.
That sums it up actually pretty neatly. And just before the show, we were actually discussing the hat that you're wearing. But before we get to that, so just before
everyone comments on my cap, but I wear it. But I'll tell you why shortly.
But just before we get to the cap. And this you don't have to go in super detail, but I'm sure, especially growing up in Botswana and early South Africa, I'm sure something must have shaped your future in joining the army and ending up doing what you're doing. Where did it start? Or let's say it, how did your formative years lead up to the Eeben Barlow that's sitting in front of us today?
As a kid growing up in what was then Botswana, I was in a small town called Francistown, which is up in the north. We used to always listen to the news. My parents wanted us to sort of be aware of what's happening around us. And every time the news came on, there were problems somewhere on this continent. It was either a coup d'etat, a civil war going on, a proxy war. And remember that the winds of change or decolonization were blowing across Africa. And when these colonial powers left Africa, in my opinion, they left a huge vacuum. And that vacuum resulted in an awful lot of tension and conflict. But these things were always at the back of my mind. Growing up, I actually wanted to be a guitarist in a rock and roll band, but I realized I was a pretty crap guitarist. So the next best thing to me was the military. So I went into the army sincerely believing I could make a difference, because that's what I thought the calling of a soldier is to, protect the weak and the innocent and to strengthen people where necessary. So that's why I ended up in the army.
And hence that question pretty much it's a lead on to why you're wearing the cap, because I assume after basics at some point in time you joined the 44 Parachute Brigade as a sapper, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, no, it took a long while to get to the brigade. I was called up as a sapper. I was commissioned as a sapper. Those are the engineers. My favorite subjects were demolitions and mine warfare, with a bit of infantry work in between. And I ended up as the sapper commander at 2 infantry battalions up in the old operational area in what was called Sector 10. There I met guys who were in this very interesting unit called 3-2 Battalion, and with a lot of begging and pleading and basically dishonesty, I ended up at 3-2 Battalion, which I enjoyed tremendously. And then I came back.
Why dishonesty? Sorry to fall back you, but why dishonesty? How did that come about?
I had to generate my own signal to transfer myself to where I wanted to be, because the battalion couldn't take me because I wasn't an infantryman. So the next best thing I could do was I could send a signal which supposedly originated from Army headquarters in Pretoria, saying that I need to be transferred with immediate effect to this battalion. So that's how I ended up. But it was only in 79, 80, I can't remember the exact year, that I ended up with the first parachute engineers. And these were sappers that were trained to be deployed with 44 Parachute Brigade. So they became what was known as P Troop of 44 Parachute Brigade. The cap I'm wearing actually has a link to the brigade, although the brigade no longer exists. It's now become a regiment, which is very sad as far as I'm concerned. However, be that as it may, within the parachute fraternity, there are different veterans groups, and I belong to one called Relentless. So whenever I'm exposed to the public, I wear my Relentless cap because I'm a very proud member of Relentless. So that's the cap story.
So did you any operations with the 44 Parachute Brigade, or did you end up immediately in Sector 10 and then went to 3-2 Battalion?
No, I was, as I said, with 2 infantry battalions in Sector 10, where I was mainly involved in mine warfare, doing the odd bit of demolitions, and at a stage doing what was called the suicide run at night. But
please explain more.
Well, explain that.
I was with 5-3 Infantry Battalion, and the battalion commander was a very strict disciplinarian and good man. Commandant Yori Jordan said to me one day, he wants to lure out the enemy to attack us, and when they attack us, we can then counterattack or lure them into attacking us, and then we can react against them before, hopefully, that they attack us.
So going into their ambush and then re-ambushing them.
Yes. And that task, unfortunately or fortunately, fell on the sappers to do. So every night at last light, we would do what was called a suicide run. We had a vehicle specially rigged up with rockets in their tubes, but that we could launch from inside the biffles. And we would travel down from Ondangwa to Oshivelo, to the gate, which was sort of the entrance into the sector, at last light, hoping we'd be ambushed. And about 100, 200 meters behind us would be an infantry platoon that would, once we drove into the ambush, we would initiate the rockets, open fire on the enemy, and the infantry would assault the enemy ambush position. So that was the plan. It seemed to work pretty well, although we only once sort of did something. But other than that, the enemy left us alone. Fortunately.
I would love to see a photo of that buffle rigged with all the rockets inside. That must have been quite a show.
Well,
something
sorry, Ruan, I was going to say, there was also the idea to tow a small trailer behind it fitted with claymores. Claymore is a direct fragmentation line. But we realized if we detonated it, we'd actually blow up the trailer. And in the military, you sign for a vehicle, and I wasn't prepared to sign for a trailer and then have to explain what happened to the trailer. So
what did they call it? Staatseiendom beskadiging. Yes.
Yeah, no, you could get into big trouble.
Yeah. And for the English people, that is government
Destruction of government property.
Destruction of government property, something like that. Yeah.
It would probably be the purposeful destruction of government property.
Yeah, but so a bit of a strange question. So you mentioned, as a sapper, you were involved with, with mines and all that kind of stuff. So you see in the movies, the guys doing the sweeping, and then always some hero steps on a mine and then he freezes. And then another hero comes along with a knife, and he now has to dig his chummy out. Yeah. I assume it's complete bullshit, but
I'm very fortunate. I never got into that position, Ruan.
But how does if you guys were to lay mines and at a later stage had to pass through again, obviously you knew where all this kind of stuff was where the minefields and the routes that you did mine. But how do you clean it up later?
Well, look, first of all, what you see in the movies is guys walking into a minefield or mines. We'd refer to them as nuisance minefields. In other words, mines laid in a specific area just to slow down people or to cause a casualty or two. They were laid by the enemy primarily. And our job as sappers was to clear the roads so that vehicles could travel the roads without being blown up. And then obviously once enemy bases had been taken, to clear what we would call caches, where they would hide their enemy or their explosives, ammunition, etc. And oftentimes these were booby trapped. So booby trap means you pick up a crate and the whole lot just explodes. So our job was to clean that. In terms of guys in the movie stepping on a mine and someone comes up and says, freeze, don't move, pulls his knife out from between his teeth or something and saves the guy's life. As I say, I'm lucky that never happened to us. But if you are laying mines to stop the enemy, those are usually known as either defensive minefields in front of defensive positions or barrier minefields and aimed at channelizing the enemy into a specific killing ground. Each of those minefields are very carefully recorded and mapped, so we know where each mine is. And when I say we know where each mine is, it's actually very approximate, because once a mine is laid, they can actually shift underground. But you will have the general area where it is, and you have a mine detector. And so, the guys will go into that area, which the minefields are. And the same applies if we knew where enemy minefields were. And we would breach that minefield, in other words, open a lane into the minefield and through it, and then start clearing up from the sides and disposing of those mines.
That must be a harrowing job, yeah.
One thing that always amazed me was these sappers were, I was pretty young myself still. I mean, I was like 22, 23, but these were kids that had come out of school the previous year and were actually doing what is very dangerous work, and they were doing it with a smile. And I was always amazed at how quickly the human can adapt to a certain environment, number one, and number two, how well trained these kids were and how determined and motivated they were to actually do their jobs.
That was going to be one of my questions. Yeah, sorry. That was one of my questions, is like the training, what level training it was. But just in that comment, it seems that the training must have been of a very high standard.
Well, someone once calculated just during the war that the sappers walked the distance, because we would walk in front of all the vehicle convoys on gravel roads to sweep them, walked a distance to the moon and back. And that's a hell of a distance to walk. I was once part of a sweep team that walked from a place called Ruakana, which is up on the southwest Angolan border, to a town in what was then southwest, now Namibia, called Komanyop. and we had to sweep that for mines. So, it's a hell of a walk. And the guys who were with me were what we refer to as citizen force guys. And these were guys that we called up periodically for 3 months, come up and do a camp and go home. I tell you one thing, those guys walked the walk. They did whatever they had to do on that bloody road, and it was far. And when we got to Comanyap, we had to walk back to Ruakana. So, and that's just one example of these sweep teams and the incredible work they did.
Yeah, I met some of the MAG guys in Oshakati in '99. They were still busy with some small clearing operations in just into the border of Angola. And no, these, like, I would venture saying it's some of the, not the coolest in terms of they're cool, not cool cats, but they were very, very sharp, very intelligent, and very reserved. Probably not reserved, but they seemed very calm and collected for a group of men together. It was quite interesting to see at that time. Yeah.
You see, sappers are usually very cool, calm, and collected guys. And we always say that we are actually in the army so that the infantry can have heroes. They don't like it, but that's what we.
It actually makes sorry, Rowan. It actually makes a lot of sense because it's not that I did not think about it, but I've sort of always understood that like the American Special Forces, they used to recruit a lot of the EOD guys. So, but if those guys can function under that type of pressure and at that technical level, I suppose it's a proper fit. And I think your case in point for that as well.
Our army obviously worked very different from what the US military or the British Army does. We had our roots in basically the British Army because it was the old colonial army that was sort of inherited when South Africa became a republic, and then adaptations were made to it, etc. But with all due respect, I make fun of ragging the infantrymen about the sappers, but I will tell you one thing. I don't think there was one unit in the SADF that didn't function optimally. Of course, there were rotten apples in certain units, but you have them in any army, no matter where you could be. But generally speaking, and white troops, black troops, so-called troops of color, be they guys of mixed blood or mixed race or what people refer to as coloreds, there were never any problems. I mean, everyone was together. They were soldiers. They were there to do a job. The guys worked together. And for the life of me, I don't recall one incident where there was a problem. But I have to say that I take my hats off to those young guys of 18, 19 who would go out on patrol, go and lay ambushes, do attacks on bases. And if you really think about it, 12, 14 months ago, he was still at school. And suddenly he's the soldier. In many instances, he's not old enough to vote, but he can go out and kill people on behest of the voters.
Yeah, my son is 16, and just to think, like I know a lot of my uncles and family, they were in the army by the time they were 17, which is it's crazy to fathom.
Yeah, but so I want to take another step back into, so you mentioned earlier that you guys would deal with booby traps in weapons caches, and just explain briefly, how would you tackle something like that? I mean, if you walk into this village, it's completely unknown, and what do you actually look out for? What's kind of telltales, and what are the things that you would say, okay, hold on, we need specialist guys that would have been yourself or whatever to kind of figure out if there is a problem here, and yeah.
Oftentimes you don't have time to go in and have deep thoughts or become all philosophical about this, because you're running on a timetable or a schedule. Every cache or mine that was used by the enemy or laid by the enemy was different. I mean, there's no real template that you can say what worked here is going to work over there. But generally speaking, The sappers would clear around this area for anti-personnel mines, look for tripwires. And then how do you go about it? All I can say is bloody carefully, because that's the only way to do it. And you've really just got to think very carefully that if I pick up this box, there could be something underneath it. How am I going to handle that? And in many instances, we would put ropes on those boxes and actually pull them out of a bunker or out of a cache to see if they detonate or not.
Yeah.
But I recall, often finding young sappers who were for the first time, and they could be officers or NCOs or just sappers, in a situation like that. And obviously there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of nervousness involved, because doing something stupid, you won't only kill yourself, you could kill a lot of people. Once I was able, and I recall one incident where I was able to say to the guy, now just remember you were trained. All this is, go back and think what you were taught, and then just follow those guidelines. And I'm here if you need me. So, and he did the job superbly. So I think really it's just every situation is different. A lot of guys react differently under pressure. But as soon as you redirect them and you help them sort of realize that everyone's scared, everyone's nervous, but we'll be scared and nervous afterwards once we've cleared this cache or something. And then we can have a chat about it, or maybe even a laugh when you say how scared you were. But that's it. I mean, there's no great big secret. But I also have to say that, the technology in the world has changed. The enemy at that stage didn't have a lot of the sort of modern technology that you could use to initiate a booby trap or a landmine, such as photosensitive cells and timers and stuff like that. So in a way, it was much easier then than what it would be today.
What is a photosensitive cell? What is that?
Okay, the SADF at times used them, although they were still under development. What it is, you would connect this to a mine via a battery, and you would cover it up. And as soon as it was exposed to light, in other words, the enemy sapper would open it, and sunlight would get onto that cell, it would detonate. So the enemy at that stage didn't have that. So, we were very fortunate.
Yeah, it's if I have to frame it in terms of what I wanted to do, my initial idea going to the army was I'd either want to fly cheetahs and mirages, and then helicopters, and then I want to be a parabat. So and then I figured out, I think I was too tall to be a pilot when I was in standard 6 already. So it didn't work out that well. But now, when you guys, when you obviously trained as a sapper, did you guys come out as proper officers or NCOs? And how long was the training?
Well, look, initially, and again, I speak for the time I was there, and I can't say it's still exactly the same. You would go on, you would do your basic training, which was give or take 3 months. During that 3 months, you would be evaluated in terms of seeing who had the abilities. And when I say you'd be evaluated by your instructors, who were officers and NCOs. This guy has the making to be a non-commissioned officer. This guy has the making to be an officer. And then they would sort of guide you and direct you, and you'd go on a particular course in order to understand what are the duties of an officer and what are the duties of an NCO. And, officers shouldn't try and become NCOs. In other words, try and take over the NCO non-commissioned officer's job. But you're there to support him, and he's there to support you. And that training was, if I remember correctly, about 8-9 months, I think. I'll have to go look on all my old papers. But you then get qualified as a second lieutenant or as a corporal. But you then just know enough for everyone else to realize bugger all. I remember getting to a squadron. I'd just become a second lieutenant. I was like really chuffed with myself. Reported to the squadron commander, who didn't even look up. I did my best parade ground halt salute, almost chopped my own bloody head off. And all he said to me was, go next door and see the sergeant major. And that was my introduction to the squadron I arrived at. And I got next door, and there sat the sergeant major, and he said to me, Lieutenant, and he didn't even get up. I was still in that frame of, this is the sergeant major. I stand to attention when I speak to him, which I did. And I said, Sergeant Major, I'm Second Lieutenant Barlow. I've been told to report to you. And he looked up and he said to me, very good, Lieutenant. He said, now remember one thing, this is my squadron. You want to do something, you talk to me. You want to know something, you talk to me. And that was the best mentor I had as a junior officer. So the point I'm trying to make is that the guys who become non-commissioned officers, there's often this, it's almost as though people want to say they weren't good enough to become officers, which is absolute rubbish. They are guys who can take young soldiers or even young officers and mentor them to become the men they ought to be within a unit. And I'm forever grateful to having had really good NCOs, non-commissioned officers with me, that oftentimes knew way more than I did because of their years of experience, but I learned from them. And as soon as they understand that, you don't see yourself above them, they also try and help you as best they can. And I think that's a good relationship to have. It's a relationship built on respect. I respect him, he respects me. And when there are things that I don't know, the senior non-commissioned officer knows that I will come and ask him, because ultimately it's about lives and it's about doing a job properly.
Yeah, it's not about it's not necessarily about who's right. It's getting all the information from everybody and sharing it and learning. Yes, it must have been the learning curve must have been nice and tight in that specific period. Yeah. So I think one of our listeners commented here, and I don't know if you would recall. I think his name is. Let me just Sean McAfee. And he's referenced some story about where a truck was burning and you walked over, picked up the munitions and dumped it away from the ammo. I don't know. Do you recall something like that? Yes,
actually, Sean's being sneaky now. I think we actually discussed that a few months ago. I was part of 3-2's reconnaissance wing, and we'd just come back from an operation in Angola. And we were put into a base, sort of like transiting through the base. And we were sitting down, and an infantry patrol came in, and they were motorized, so they had vehicles with them, and they debussed from the vehicles, and then they offloaded the ammunition, and there was a case that had in what's called white phosphorus hand grenades. And I saw the smoke coming out of this case of white phosphorus grenades, and a lot of other people did as well, and they sort of moved away as quickly as they could from it. And being a sapper and knowing the infantry need heroes, I stupidly jumped up, ran and grabbed the case, threw it over the base's wall. And then the other sappers came later once it had sort of burnt out and destroyed what was left. But that had to be done. Someone had to do it, or else, lives could be lost, or government equipment damaged, military equipment, vehicles, weapons, etc. So, you make a snap decision, and later you think how stupid you were.
Yeah.
But so this question actually took us into what I wanted to get to. So you as you said, you sneak your way in. Now you're in 3-2, got what you wanted. So what now? What? Talk to us a little bit about your time there.
I had a wonderful opportunity in 3-2 Battalion because I was with the reconnaissance wing, and I became eventually the second in command of the reconnaissance wing, which was a little bit unheard of because I was a sapper, not an infantryman. But, I look back on it and I think how fortunate I was that I had an outstanding commander who was a legend, in terms of small team operations, etc. And I had wonderful non-commissioned officers who would, without making me feel stupid, actually tell me that I'm being stupid. And these guys were wonderful mentors and guides to me. And so to me, it was just, probably one of the most challenging and best experiences of my life. Well, one of them was being part of that unit, because it was such a small, tight unit. I think when I got there, if I recall correctly, that the entire reconnaissance wing was like 16 men or something. So it was very, very small, and it was the eyes and ears of the battalion, but it operated independently. And the commander was a very, very competent man who went out of his way to make sure I could do what was expected of me. And eventually, on my first operation, I was the radio operator. I carried the radio, and when I say I carried the radio, it was a big bloody high-frequency radio, all the ammunition that I needed, plus ammunition for the machine gun. Plus, I carried what was known as VHF or UHF radio, which were short-range radios or ground-to-air radios. So I was really loaded with stuff.
Was it one of those Fuchs AIB 25s? Those green monsters?
Well, I don't know what they were. They were bloody heavy.
It's actually quite funny, because I just recently passed my radio amateur exam, and a friend of mine's father passed away, and he had a lot of radio equipment that we're sorting out for him. And one of the radios in it is this huge green box AIB Fuchs 25 military radio. And the first time I picked it up, and it doesn't have the battery, and I'm like, yeah, I'm glad I wasn't the guy lugging this thing around. It's crazy. Yeah. So.
Well, our commander was very ingenious, because he actually made spare battery packs for them. So you would carry, I, as the signaller, had to carry the spare battery packs as well. And, just like a funny incident, there was a contact with the enemy. I was carrying all these radios and things, and the handset was right behind my back. And I eventually got tired in the attack, because I was really carrying it. And I bent down to put my hands on my knees and stood there like a donkey, huffing and puffing. And I actually heard the gunship saying, "We've got one of them." And I'm thinking, that's great. And I heard him saying, or I heard the commander saying, "Well, don't shoot him, because we need to interrogate him." And I'm still thinking to myself, wow, that's now pretty smart. And when I looked up, I saw the gunship circling me, and because I couldn't reach the handset, I couldn't tell them, I'm actually a friendly. Luckily, they couldn't shoot. And, the guys came to rescue me. So, there are funny things that happen, but in that moment, they're not particularly funny if you're looking down the barrel of a 20mm cannon in a gunship.
That was one of the things in the back of my head now. It's like your transition, obviously, from the sappers to 3-2. Your tempo must have climbed dramatically, and your physical fitness and all that. Was that a big transition for you?
No, sappers are generally very fit guys.
With the walking and
said quite honestly, because we walk massive distances. I think what was required was a sort of a mental transition from being sappers. We were often very defensive. In other words, we would do stuff after the enemy had done it. So we would go and lift the mines after the enemy had laid them. And suddenly the mind shift was, there's no more time for being defensive. It's now offensive. It's now we laying the ambushes, we taking the initiative. We will ambush them and let them now, suffer the consequences.
Yeah, that transition, was it quick?
Well, they threw me into it bloody quickly. They being the guys who were there, the old hands, very quickly trained me in their radio procedures. I had to learn Morse code very quickly. All the enemy weapons, which were then Soviet bloc weapons, they went back and didn't go back, but they retaught me what I thought I knew in terms of infantry work, and made sure that I wouldn't let the team down, basically. So I go back and say, but for an outstanding commander and really good non-commissioned officers, I think my life would have been incredibly difficult.
Yeah, and so would I be correct in saying that obviously your time in 3-2, that was almost of great importance in your career later? And there've been some lessons that you've learned there that you still carry with you to this day, and obviously contributed greatly to the success that you've had later in your career. Can you maybe just go into a little bit on some of the things that you learned there that you still apply in modern times in some of the stuff you did later on?
Ron, it's actually a very difficult question to answer, because wherever I went, I learned certain lessons, and often you learn those lessons subconsciously. Someone posted something the other day which I thought was very true, and he said that in war, no one is right, or you are not right, you only survive. And I think that really spells it out to me very succinctly. What did I learn? I learned that if you're working with a team, the team has to have a unified goal, and that goal is what everyone works for. I learned that you can never expect someone to do something he hasn't been prepared for. In other words, that he isn't qualified to do. I go back and I use a very simple example. Our medics we had were outstanding medics. I certainly couldn't do their job. So if someone said to me I must be a medic, I would have been a terrible medic. On the other hand, these guys would go and do their job. So what I learned was you use men for what they are capable of doing. But ultimately, you have to provide guidance. And by providing guidance doesn't mean you know everything. What it means is you set the direction of what's going to take place, and you get the correct men, correctly led, at the right place and time to do what's expected of them. And I think that's probably, to me, the most critical lesson I learned. But there's always times when things go wrong. There will be someone in a team, whether it be in whatever unit, that at that critical moment suddenly loses confidence in himself. And in doing that, he endangers everyone in the unit. And I think that's probably one of the things that any commander always is concerned with at the back of his mind. Who is going to let me down? You trust everyone, but there could be someone who's going to let you down. And if that happens, what are you going to do to rectify that?
We've got it's actually tying into a question I had, but one of our listeners, Michael Davis, he actually asked the question about your thoughts on the national militaries in Africa today, and that they are clinging to outdated models. But it's one of those things that it's sort of stuck with me. It's always been a question, and I think you've got a lot of experience working with other African militaries as well, is the professionalism and the infrastructure. And you were speaking about leadership now and a good goal. Do you think that a lot of the African militaries, especially where you had personally had a hand in, it was down to just a good leader and a good process of applying what needed to be done?
Groby, I have a problem in terms of African armies. I don't have a problem the fact that they are the armies. And let me tell you, there is nothing wrong with a man material. I love working with African soldiers because they are keen, they are motivated, they are determined to succeed. And that makes the job of any leader very easy. The problem I have is that many African armies are throw-offs from the old colonial armies, be they British Army or French Army or whatever. The way they were structured was the way those colonial armies were structured. The doctrine that they were taught, in other words, doctrine doesn't tell you what you must do. It tells you how to do things. Okay, the doctrines are outdated because those doctrines and armies were what was used in the Second World War, and then just sort of modified to fight the Soviets in Europe. And therefore, we find that these troops are very determined to do good and to fight well and to serve their countries. I'm giving you my opinion. But they're at a disadvantage because they have been put in a position where the doctrine they are taught is not applicable to either the terrain or the enemy. And doctrine follows terrain and enemy as far as I'm concerned. And as soon as we teach them a different way of doing things and we structure them differently, we suddenly start getting results from these troops. And that brings me to a point that concerns me very, very much, is that we have foreign powers sending their militaries to Africa for so-called partnership training, where the training is, first of all, what we've encountered in several countries, very poor, number one. Oh, yes. And number two is totally irrelevant to the terrain and the enemy. And then you get this young soldier from abroad who's sent to Africa. I mean, he doesn't decide he's going to Africa. His government sends him, his armed forces send him. And he's trying to teach troops who've been fighting for 10, 15 years on how they must now fight. And he doesn't understand the terrain. He doesn't understand the enemy. He actually doesn't understand the war. There's the famous story of a foreign general who was in Africa, and I won't go into great detail about it, who got confused about Rwanda and Luanda.
Oh, wow.
And if that stems from the top of an army, just imagine what flows down at the bottom. And things like that I find very, very disturbing, because these soldiers go out, they live hard and rough. When they fight very, very well, but they're at a disadvantage. And I pity them that they are at such a disadvantage, because if they weren't at that disadvantage, man, they would clean up all of these wars in Africa.
So this is probably my only full sort of semi-political question, is that, do you think that's probably why Boko Haram and they are those jihadist terrorists are having such successes and not being quelled as quickly as possible?
Look, I think you're speaking about Nigeria, and let me say again to you, those Nigerian troops we worked with were very good troops. And I get sick and tired of reading in the media negativity toward the Nigerian soldiers, because they were good guys. When they had to fight, they fought. When they had to party, they partied. They were typical soldiers of Africa. Having said that, yes, they're at a disadvantage. First of all, they again, from our point of view, the structures in which they are deployed or employed are not correct for the terrain and the threat. I don't think the training is focused at the threat and the terrain either, which automatically puts them at a disadvantage. In Nigeria, we were part of what was called the 7th Infantry Division, based at Maiduguri. And I look at the division commander. He was a good man. He was willing to listen. He was willing to debate issues. And if he felt we were wrong, he would qualify why he thought we were wrong. And we would do the same with him. So, it's a matter of respecting, or professional respect, that there ought to be. You cannot arrive in a African country and start dictating how things must be. But what you can do is actually try and guide them and ask them for the opportunity to do something differently. And if you do ask and they understand why you're asking, they allow you to do it. Yeah. So, back to Nigeria. Nigeria have been the beneficiaries of foreign training for several years. Why haven't they achieved anything? And it's not it
makes sense now. Yeah.
Let me tell you, it's not the troops. It's not the soldiers. Those are good soldiers.
It's the doctrine and the application of leadership to it. Yeah.
Yeah, and the training that is taught to them by their foreign trainers is, as far as we're concerned, window dressing training. But if you look through the window, the room's empty.
It's ticking a box. It's like provide
That's all
foreign training. Yes, we've
That's
provided foreign training, but there wasn't proper thought or strategy put to it. Guys, just thanks, Rudy Detroit. Thanks for that question. There was another question, and
Robbie, I'd just like to go back and say one thing. You know, we worked
Yes.
in the Central African region with troops from an army, and we were carrying heavy kit through bad jungle. And just to give you an idea of the type of mentality of those troops, they knew I was a lot older than them. But every morning, one of them would be there to ask if he could carry my kit for me, despite the heavy weight they were carrying. You know, and that says a lot about the men I'm working with. So I love working with African troops.
that's great.
But even, you know, you in a previous interview we did earlier in the year with a former operator, I asked him, you know, what in his opinion is probably some of the biggest myths that is out there about the enemy, you know, you guys faced, you know, in during the border war. And of course you would have completely different insight, you know, during your time with EAO as well. And one thing he said to me was, there's this misconception that the people we faced or the enemy was demotivated, undertrained, underfunded,
Incompetent and all that.
and incompetent. And based on what you're saying now, you know, it just once again proves that what you read is not always the whole truth.
No, absolutely. Ron, you know, I take my hat off to the enemy we faced in what was then Southwest, SWAPO, or really their military wing clan, the People's Liberation Army of Namibia. Because you know that when those guys started off, they walked from Dar es Salaam. They walked into ultimately Southwest Africa to blow up a post office, and then had to walk back. Now, I don't know many guys who would do that, just for a start. The second thing is they were aggressive. They fought well when they fought. Yes, there were times when, you know, they had to run. If you're caught in an ambush and you're certainly not going to make it out there, you have one thought on your mind, and that's getting out of that ambush. To them, it was exactly the same. But these guys, I still respect them. I've actually met many of them. And now we can laugh about the war and joke about it. But I still say they were very good soldiers. And whoever told you that, I agree 100% with
him. Just leading on to that now, Eeben, and it's a question somebody actually asked. I just want to find out his name here. Sorry, so just a quick one. Oh, here we go. It's from David Hurrell. And it's something that I've always sort of had in the back of my head, not as a negative comment or as a negative observation, but something that sort of stuck with me is our, and you said now, especially when the guy started running, the tactic of relentless pursuit. Relentless pursuit, I suppose in the current situations in Afghanistan and those places, why couldn't the U.S. military? Was it just the terrain or the type of enemy that just didn't allow for that type of relentless pursuit? And because once you find the enemy and make contact, why don't pursue them until you kill them all? Do you have any insight in that? Look, like I said, I'm not an infantry specialist. I don't know anything about that, but that's and thanks, David Hurrell, for reminding me of that. The relentless pursuit. Why wouldn't the Americans employ a strategy like that?
Well, first of all,
Sorry, Eeben.
Yes.
Sorry for interrupting you. Maybe just for 30 seconds, explain to the listeners what is relentless pursuit or the concept.
Okay. In my mind, relentless pursuit is once I have made contact with the enemy, I maintain that contact. In other words, I maintain momentum. I maintain the initiative throughout the fight with the enemy, and I force him to either succumb to my attack or to break his will to fight. But I never give him an opportunity to escape. That is, in my mind, what relentless pursuit is. Why the US and other forces didn't apply it wherever, I cannot comment because I wasn't there, probably. But I know that from a point of view in Africa, we are often prohibited from actually applying relentless pursuit for the simple fact that African armies have been misled in terms of certain equipment they need, and the assets that they really need, they often don't possess. And that's something that really burns my goat, because, you know, if I call for air support, I want air support to be there. I don't want to be told the pilots are tired because it's some subcontractor that some foreign company is paying for. And that is what we have found in Africa. So, you know, relentless pursuit means I maintain this pressure on the enemy, but I cannot maintain that pressure on the enemy if I do not have the assets in which to do it. And the assets, I'm speaking mainly of either helicopters or vehicles that I can leapfrog troops to maintain contact with him and actually close with the enemy and do battle with him and eliminate him.
And it sounds, again, we always, like, our favorite comment is amateurs talk equipment, professionals talk logistics. And it seems it's, again, the logistics and that level of it seems to play a major role. Now, I was just wondering, and I thought you might have a little bit more insight on it. But now, talking a little bit rest about Africa, any sort of comment on what's happening in Mozambique at the moment? We're getting drips and drabs of some terrorist activity there. What's your view on that current situation?
Well, first of all, I think it's a very serious situation which is being underreported on and to a large extent ignored. The fact of the matter is that the mere ability of the enemy to do what he's done in Mozambique says to me that there's been a huge intelligence failure. Number one, because intelligence means you are going to know what is coming. In other words, you can start predicting what the enemy will do. The second thing is that we see with this enemy is that he's adaptable, he's agile, he makes extensive use of surprise, and he's allowed to get away with it simply because there's no reaction. You know, the warnings to Mozambique were issued to them in 2017 already. I know because I issued those warnings. And the warnings were issued based on intelligence officers in Africa who I'd got to know very well, who were warning me of what's coming and what routes these guys are taking. And this was passed on to the relevant authorities who did nothing. There is now a group in Mozambique, you've probably all heard about them, that are actually working there and trying to do something. But I fear that they are not doing enough as quickly as they should be doing it. And I think they are being hampered by the lack of assets. And then, of course,
it's super crazy.
Sorry, you have to have a look at that area where it's happened. Has been undergoverned or ungoverned for years. There's no infrastructure. It's almost as though those people don't exist. Then there are tensions between law enforcement and the armed forces. And all of these things have really played into the hands of the enemy up there. So, you know, the only way to really stop this is to develop a decent campaign strategy, train the people, equip them correctly, and take them up there and clear that area. But once the area is cleared, remember, this is going to be a political solution, not a military solution. But the military have to create the conditions.
The conditions for the political solution, yeah.
But
I had family. Sorry, Rowan. Sorry, just on a side note, I had family that were involved with the building of the gas pipeline. And if I tell you this is maybe 9 years ago, and 9 years ago, it's anecdotal evidence, there was already problems in that area regarding this. It's just amazing to me how, like you said, it's ignored and just swept under the carpet. It's crazy.
Well, it's also a stronghold of what was an armed group many years ago known as Renamo, that have now laid down their arms and started negotiating with government several years ago. So you have that in the mix as well. So, you know, the victims are really the civilian population who live there. They're unarmed. They're ignored by government. It's almost as though it's a little country that doesn't really exist. And they just have to suffer the brunt of whatever everyone does to them.
Even in both of the last kind of questions that you've answered, you've hammered quite heavily on the availability of assets to get the job done. So I need to kind of try to understand the logistics of what you guys do. So let's say, for example, a country approaches you guys, right? They have a particular problem, and they need your and your company's skill set to assist them. Obviously, you need to look at it from a business perspective because you need to pay salaries and do that kind of stuff. But in terms of equipment, I mean, does the country that you will help, is that their problem? And you send the knowledge and the manpower and the expertise. Do you source certain things yourself? How does that work in a kind of almost a day-to-day operational perspective? How do you deal with these problems? Because obviously you can't shift certain things in and out of the borders. Just talk me a little bit, kind of how do you deal with those kind of stuff?
Okay, well, look, you know, if a government approaches us, we first of all analyze what is their national security strategy. Now, oftentimes they don't have a national security strategy that's written down. They know what they want to achieve. Then what we recommend is that we develop a campaign strategy. And that's a campaign that will then go and sort out the problem. If they accept the campaign strategy, they will ask us to prepare a proposal for them. In that proposal, we will say we need 50 of our people, and you as the army have to give us 1,000 of your people. We are going to select them and train them and get them down to a group of, you know, just for argument's sake, 200 people. But we need the following equipment with which to commence operations. And we tell them what equipment we need. That equipment is for them to purchase, not for us, because it's their money, it's their country, and they have to put skin in that game as well, hence the troops and the equipment. But by the time we leave, we want those troops to be able to just continue without us. It's a system that's worked all over, and of course there have been problems. You know, we can't get certain equipment, or governments refuse to sell equipment to them, or foreign powers try and prevent those governments from buying the equipment. And believe you me, when I say that what we're seeing in Mozambique is happening in other places as well. And sadly, people have yet to realize that our continent is at war. But in this war, we have a lot of chancers who come in and convince governments to buy obsolete equipment no one else wants, or rubbish they're never going to use, because the seller makes a lot of money out of it. We're not interested in selling equipment to governments. We are there to advise them and to guide them, to train their men, to make sure those men are ready for battle, and then to take those men to battle, because we don't want to train men and send them off on their own. Not that we don't trust them, but simply we don't want them to think that we are exposing them to a danger we're not prepared to put ourselves into. Now, this has led to a lot of problems from our own government over here who threatened to arrest us. You know, and that has caused a backlash within Africa concerning us. You know, when we were in Nigeria, helping the Nigerian government to combat a very vicious terror threat, there were government ministers in South Africa calling for our immediate arrest. Yeah. You know, the perception created then at the Nigerian point of view was that our government is actually supporting this terrorist group that's there because they don't want them to end. So, there's a whole lot of...
That's actually that's a
and
different way of looking at it. Oh.
Well, a Nigerian general said to me, he will see one day when South Africa has a similar problem, who do they call on to help? To us, it's very sad, because ultimately we're all in Africa. And I don't care what color your skin is. If you are fighting to stop an armed threat, murdering, raping, pillaging, doing whatever they want to do, and just allowing them to happen, we are all part of that problem. We are not a solution, and we're actually complicit in it.
Yeah, and
let's go and stop it now.
And it's scary because I think if you sum it up in a couple of words, what's happening in Mozambique is pretty much a leadership vacuum, where there's also in an area where there isn't real government control. And for the lack of a better description, if those types of situations would come to our shores, I don't see a much better outcome, because it's pretty much just a lack of leadership if you dumb it down to that.
Well, I wouldn't say it's a lack of leadership. I think, despite the fact that the SANDF has suffered huge setbacks, I think there are still very capable leaders within it. I think there are also leaders in it that are not capable, and I think you find that in any army. I think, however, our big problem here is we've adopted this wait-and-see attitude, and the longer you wait, the stronger the enemy gets. That on the one hand. On the other hand is the fact that these conflicts have taken place all over Africa, and apart from our involvement in the DRC, we're not doing anything. Which also brings me to a point to say, let's look at the UN. How many billions of dollars have been spent in the DRC and in any other place, and there's still zero results. So it's inconceivable that such a force with that amount of money and ability to procure assets cannot make a dent in these so-called insurgencies. And I have to tell you, I think it's bullshit, number one, because if those wars end, those people don't need to be here, because then they can go home. On the other hand, it suits businesses because they benefit from these conflicts.
War is business. War is big business. Yeah.
And then you have these media types who have no clue where these countries are, trying to criticize and saying they stand for democracy, but as soon as the government contracts us, they shout and claim that government's not allowed to contract us. In other words, saying a democratic government is not allowed to make decisions unless some journalist in the media has approved it. And while they're playing their standing on the high ground attitude, people are dying. People are losing their limbs. People are losing all of their possessions. People are becoming internally displaced. There's famine, there's hunger. And with all the money that's been put in, let's just look at Mogadishu. How much money has gone into there? Let's have a look at how much money has been put into Nigeria, into Niger, into Chad, into Cameroon, into the DRC. Where are the results? How can it be zero?
It sort of reminds me of how pretty much a pilot and one hind made a spectacular impact in Sierra Leone. And you think about the oodles of money and the firepower that the UN actually can bring to bear, but they don't do it effectively. And that you raise a very valid point. That
the Executive Outcomes force that was there, okay, the media said it was an army. We came with our own tanks and stuff. We had no equipment. We used what they have. We used what a government has. The 250 men is what it ultimately was, and that's taking into account guys leaving, guys coming, etc., was replaced with over 15,000 men of the UN, who then lost control of the situation, had to call in the British and American armies to come and rescue it, and the UN say it's their greatest success story ever. And things like that are actually mind-boggling. And if people in Africa think the UN or anyone else is here because they love Africans, they must disabuse themselves of that notion immediately. People who think that when South Africa implodes, the UN or some foreign power is going to come rushing in to help, disabuse yourselves of that notion immediately, because there are foreign powers instigating a lot of what we are experiencing.
Nobody's coming to help us. Yeah.
See the bigger picture. We're going to carry on talking in circles while the country sinks deeper and deeper into a quagmire.
Do you? I mean, I said to somebody a while ago that the UN reminds me of the toothless dog barking from the other side of the fence, and it was echoed by somebody I know whose wife works for them. And I mean, come on, if you work for them and you agree that that explains a lot.
The tragedy is there are people within the UN who really want to make a difference. You know, when I speak of the UN, I'm generalizing.
Yeah.
But there are people who want to make a difference, but they cannot. I mean, look at the genocide in Rwanda. I mean, how tragic that this has to happen. But go one step further. We sit on the wealthiest continent in the world, yet we are the poorest. Explain that to me. You know, and all that we see unfolding is false promises by political leaders. And I don't care which party they belong to. All of them are lying. It doesn't matter which one you are talking of, which party you are talking of. And they are all blaming someone else because no one wants to be held accountable for the mess they're creating.
Yeah, there's no ownership.
No, absolutely nothing. You know, and in order to hide the failure, they resort to populism. And populism in itself has a lot of negative side effects. And one of those is it can result in a sense of nationalism developing. So, you know, the impact of populism is that you can force certain people, if you blame them and marginalize them enough, to start coming together and start developing a nationalist approach to things, which could even lead to fights for secession. And all these things suit all of these foreign governments, whether they're from the East or the West, because they'll come in, sell equipment, take control of the resources, and make sure their interests are protected. And that's why they disabuse themselves of this notion.
That was one of our listeners' questions, is that the whole of Africa, and then obviously South Africa in tune with that, the sort of shift towards communism and the like you said, the populism angle of it actually makes a lot of sense. And just comment on this. So my personal point of view is that the average South African wants an opportunity to live his life and work and provide for his family, and as simple as that. The majority of South Africans. And right now, the game, like you said, it's the populist game, and
it's pure populism. And I would go as far as to say 95% of the people in Africa, and I'm not talking only South Africa, aren't interested in politics. They don't want these wars and conflicts. They want to live their life in peace. They want to be able to have security. In other words, that no one's going to come and abuse them. Or kill them, or chop their limbs off, or boil their children and eat them, is what happens. You know, if you go back to the very basic old Maslow triangle, the lower rung of the triangle is what the majority of people want. People don't want to see their infrastructure destroyed. They don't want to see anarchism. They don't want to live under tyranny. They just want to get on with their lives. And then I go and I look at the soldiers in Africa. And man, you think we have it difficult, they have it more difficult, because they have to contend with a lot of the problems happening there. Plus, they're caught between politics, and still they go out and do their jobs.
Sure.
You know, I've met troops in Africa that haven't had leave for 4 years, that have been fighting nonstop. I've met troops in Africa that hadn't been paid for 3 years, but they're still there. They're still fighting.
So it's actually the more we talk about this, and the reality of it is actually quite morbid. And
well, no, what should become morbid? You know what? If you tell us there are opportunities, and there are good men out there.
That's it.
The book I wrote, The War for Africa, is not a anti-West, anti-East, pro-communist thing. And you know what they say about communism is that I must despise my neighbor if he's successful, and what he has, I must either take away from him or destroy. That's really what it boiled down to. And I'm being very simplistic in it now. But what we're seeing happening over here is, in my opinion, the battleground between the East and the West. And until Africa wakes up and realizes it, we are going to be the losers. And we are not going to lose only in terms of what we think we have. We are going to lose everything that we could have had. And I'm not speaking of whether you're white or black or green or whatever color. I couldn't care a shit what color you are. What you need to do, and we need to do, is start taking some control of our own destiny. Governments have sold off the heritage of their countries to the Chinese. And I use the Chinese in this instance because it's well known in Africa that they've bought many governments. We need to start taking control. But the way in which we prevent it from doing this is populist politics that's intervening. You know, there are good white people and there are bad white people. There are good black people and there are bad black people. So to me, it's not about what color of skin you are. It's what are you doing? And unfortunately, we're not doing enough to bitch all the time. I look at these social media groups, bitch, bitch, bitch. It's good to bitch. It makes you feel good. But let's also start becoming a little bit more constructive and try and build up something instead of breaking down everything we hear and see here.
Yeah, somebody commented that if you are talking about problems without providing a option and solutions, you are only whining. That's about it.
Well, that's a very good point because it's actually true. And believe you me, I can bitch with the best of them. But I think ultimately we have to start realizing that there are constraints, and those constraints on governments have impacted on people's lives. You know, it could be stupid policies, it could be poor economics or whatever. And all these things have a ripple effect. Right?
Have a real effect, a real impact on people's lives.
And people have consequences.
You were mentioning your is that your new book, The War for Africa, right?
Yeah.
Is that out on the shelves already?
No, it's coming out in November, Robbie. And it's a book really based on my experience, what I see unfolding, what I've been part of unfolding, and you know, places we've worked. Just as a very stupid example, the piracy off the east coast of Africa. There's a reason that piracy is happening, but ultimately it's crime. But one has to wonder who's committed the biggest crime, that those governments that were doing toxic waste dumping off the coast that killed the fish stocks, or is it those people that have almost encouraged piracy to some extent? Or is it those people that have buried toxic waste under certain roads that were built, with all the effects that come on the children that were born and the water being contaminated, etc.? But however you look at it, there are two sides to crime here. They're the guys that are actually creating the conditions for crime, and then there are guys who are exploiting those conditions. I went to meet the pirates, and we said to the pirates, look, you know, this was on behalf of a shipping company. Let's get to an agreement on this whole thing. Why are you pirates? And they told me their fish stocks are poisoned. They can't fish. They're fishermen. And we agreed on how we could actually overcome this. No one was interested.
Yeah, so
sorry, just to come back to that, no one was interested. But as they became more successful at being pirates, they were incentivized to go for bigger and more costly items to take hostage and to demand ransoms of. And they even told me that they are warned which ships they can take, because ship owners wanted to get rid of certain ships. Now, I'm talking 5 years ago or something. All of that was left, and it became a problem. And that has cost millions more dollars to now patrol the coast, not by Africa, but by foreign powers. So we don't even control our coasts anymore. And some of us being governments, have sold our security to foreign powers and put it in their hands. It's no longer in Africa's hands.
I'm very interested in the book. That sounds good read.
Eeben, do you think, with your organization, the Russians that's working in Mozambique at the moment, some of the PMCs in the Middle East, do you think there will be, I almost want to say, I think it's become a bit more generally accepted, is probably the right words for it. But do you see in the future it becoming even more and more popular to use private organizations for skill sets? You're a little bit more flexible, you're more mobile. And do you see it's something that's going to become more and more popular as time goes by?
Ruan, it's a good question, that, and let me tell you why it's a good question. To us, the irony is, as soon as we as South Africans and as Africans get involved in helping African governments sort out African problems, the world shouts at us. And that charge is usually led by people within the media and people within politics. Because according to them, democratic African governments must not be allowed to decide who they use. So the whole thing, African solutions to solve African problems, is a soundbite. The second thing is, as soon as we get involved, we are these mercenaries that need to be brought to heel and need to be put in jail, but anyone else can do it. We saw the Russians come in and get their asses handed to them on a plate, and they left very, very quickly thereafter. And this has happened in several places. Yet those people are always regarded as private military companies, and they're coming to do so-called humanitarian work. It's absolute rubbish. These companies come as the advance guard of their governments and their government's armed forces. And when their government's armed forces have left, they stay behind to make sure that vacuum does not implode. And that's what we're seeing in these countries. So to me, it's always, it's very interesting to have a look who shouts the loudest when we deploy somewhere, because immediately we know who's supporting the enemy. And it's always an indication to us. And sadly, some of these enemies we fought have come to South Africa to get advice from people. Now, that's all okay. But what's not okay is to actually go and help a government. That is deemed very, very evil. So, PMCs, private military contractors, private military companies, whatever you want to call them, yes, as long as they belong to a foreign power, they're welcome in Africa. If they are Africans trying to sort out African problems, it appears to me they must be stopped by the powers that be. And I find that very, very hypocritical.
You mentioned just now, so the Russians learned a hard lesson, and I would assume there are, some other organizations that also got a taste of real Africa. What do you think? There's obviously things like they're not familiar with the terrain and the environment and the demographics and all that kind of stuff, but why do you think it often happens if foreign powers or foreign militaries come screw around in Africa that they're taught some very hard lessons from people that's not as well trained, not as well equipped? Maybe just give some insight why something like that would typically happen, or why is it popular, or why does it often happen? Probably the right way to say it.
Well, I mean, that's a very valid point, and I think that's a point I made earlier. It's inconceivable that these powers are unable to actually make an impact against an enemy who is lesser trained, lesser equipped.
Sorry, Eeben, sorry to interrupt you. Sorry. Can I ask you to move 10 centimeters to your right because you are out of frame?
I'm drifting away, am I?
Yes, we've got you. We've got you.
Okay.
Thank you.
You know, let's go back and say, first of all, that these foreign soldiers that come into Africa because they are sent here. Unfortunately, they do not understand the dynamics of the conflict that they are sent to so-called trained forces to fight. If you don't understand the dynamics of it, it's like trying to solve a puzzle, but you don't know where the pieces are. You know, so it puts them at a disadvantage. So in a way, I pity them. But there have been instances where a foreign power's military have threatened a government that if they made use of us, they would suffer the consequences. And I find that very distasteful. They have even threatened a private national park in Africa, that if that park made use of us, that they would make sure that no funding ever came to that park. And this is a foreign military telling governments and private parks what they can and cannot do in Africa. And that begs the question, who owns Africa? Who thinks they own Africa? And I'm saying again, people who think foreign powers are going to rush in here to save you because you're white or you're black or you're green or you're yellow, think again. Disabuse yourself of that notion. Whatever we do, we have to do ourselves and do together. So why do these guys fall off the wagon? They fall off the wagon for many reasons. This is a very harsh and complex operating terrain. And there are many, many factors that impact on what's called the operating environment. There's demographics, there's economics, there's politics, there's infrastructure. So there's all sorts of stuff going on. And they don't understand that. You know, and I go back and I look at two very sad incidents. And believe you me when I say I find them very sad, because I see myself as a soldier. Okay? The Kenyan base that was overrun by Al-Shabaab several years ago, Al-Shabaab filmed that and posted it on the internet. I found it extremely distressful. And those troops, those Kenyan troops, ultimately could only do what they were trained and equipped and led to do. The second was the US Special Forces who were killed in Niger in an ambush up there. Now, I go back to saying about the operating environment and the terrain. That's desert terrain. You don't easily get ambushed in that terrain unless you are tactically not in tune with the terrain you are operating in. And I think these are the types of problems armies that are trained by foreigners experience and foreigners experience. I think the Russian guys came into Mozambique, Wagner, exactly the same. They think it's a walk in the park. It isn't a walk in the park. Because, you know, your civilian population, are caught between two forces. You know, if they don't do what you tell them to do, they get killed. If they don't do what I tell them to do, they get killed.
Is there something that makes operating in Africa unique that you will not find anywhere else?
That's a difficult question to answer. I think if I could say what makes me prefer operating in Africa, I will say the people, the soldiers.
Local knowledge, yeah.
The soldiers, Grobbie, the type of reception you get from the populace once they feel they're safe. It's a very different environment. On the other hand, it's a very harsh and unforgiving environment. And those who aren't prepared to come in here, abandon hope ye who enter, because it's not going to go well for you.
It's case in point with our first foray into Angola. and the remnants of that force ending up becoming that's principally where 3-2 Battalion was born, correct?
Mm.
And where those guys were taken within weeks on while fighting, they were trained and became one hell of a successful fighting force. It's like you've actually just cleared it up for me nicely, where it was sort of murky for me in terms of the history books that I read, because a lot of it just didn't make sense because I don't have the experience of it. But the more you talk about it, it just shows the ability and like you said, the mere fact that they are trainable makes for a very good case in point that they can be a very formidable army for any intents and purposes. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And 3-2, yes, you're correct. A lot of them were given on-the-job training until there was a bit of a respite in the war, and they could actually then go and undergo full training and come in as youngsters. But I mean, within EO and within STEP, we've had guys that in EO in particular, we had guys who served in the MK's armed wing in Konto-Wesizwe. We had guys from Zimbabwe, Namibia, Angola, Sao Tome and Principe, from Congo. And I mean, we're all Africans. How can we work together, albeit on a micro scale, and actually sort out these problems, but on a larger scale, we can't do it?
And it's true, it's stereotypical.
Sorry?
It's super stereotypical. And even from me, it's that I've always understood that our armies were integrated. People don't understand how integrated our military was in the border war. But I was at fault with stereotyping, thinking that and the average African wouldn't be a very trainable soldier. And again, you're showing quite the opposite, and it makes a lot of sense. And I think the more you mention it, it needs to be local Africans sorting out African problems. It's as simple as that. Working together.
Yeah. But is there?
Sorry, Ron.
No. What I wanted to ask was: is there a problem somewhere out there that you sit in your study and you look at this and you read the news and you see it on TV and you're chomping at the bit, hoping and praying that the phone would ring, that you think to yourself, yes, like, just let me at this?
Well, maybe if you asked me that about 6 months ago, I would have said yes. But I've stepped down as the chairman of the company I was currently chairing. But I go back to say, no matter how much we want to help and to make a positive difference, we can't. We're not on a level playing field. And we're not on a level playing field because, Company X, a private military company, come to Africa. They're sponsored by their host government, not by the African government. So first of all, that government has to make a decision. Do they pay us? Or do they get this so-called free help? But the free help never ends, and the problem usually escalates.
It's not effective, yeah.
And it gets out of control eventually.
Nothing's free.
But the private military company makes their money. They're happy with it. The government is misled into believing they're getting something for free, which they're not. And ultimately, it becomes a major problem to them. And I'll just give you a basic example. Let's go back to a country like Central African Republic. We warned the government of President Bozizi that there was a force being trained to oust him. I personally came to Durko to tell them what was going on. No one was interested in listening. And South African soldiers died there. Now, I don't care what you think of the SANDF as opposed to the SADF. The bottom line is, this is our army. This is what we have.
Soldiers,
yeah, and I will support them as much as I can. And I was disheartened to note that the warnings were there, the intelligence was given, and no one was interested in listening. that thing could have been stopped pretty quickly. But our guys weren't prepared on the ground. They weren't given the intelligence, and they were caught unawares. And despite that, some of our units up there fought magnificently. There's all these stories, they didn't do so well, etc., etc. Of course, there were guys who didn't do well, but the big majority of them did very well. The tragedy is that the warning was never passed to them, so they had no time to prepare. And I find that disturbing. I find it disturbing when I get locked up in a country because a foreign power has told them I'm a destabilizing influence on their political situation or on their government, and that's happened to me. And I get angry, but I don't get angry necessarily with the government that's just locked me up on their bloody airport. I get angry that foreign powers are playing games and encouraging political theater at the expense of the continent and its people.
Yeah, my comment always to everybody lately is that you don't know what you don't know, and the more and the older I get, and the more things I see and experience, those forces at power and why they do stuff, I don't think we know the least bit of it, and how countries and businesses are actually going about their business of not necessarily sorting things out. But yeah, at the moment, it just seems like nothing wants to really work as it's intended, and it's a crazy situation. But I think you summed it up quite good a couple of times. It should be Africans working together to solve the African problem. Simple as that.
Well, absolutely. But I understand foreign interests. I understand that Africa needs foreign investment. What I don't understand is how we've oftentimes surrendered those interests at the expense of our own domestic interests. And what I also don't understand is how can the richest continent, how can its people be the poorest? And these are questions I frequently ask myself.
So that's a serious question. That really is a serious question to ponder. Yeah.
And if I go back, when I wrote the book, there were days I felt like crying, just from what we've experienced. And I find that if you want to make an impact, or as a foreign officer said to me one day, if you're not with us, you're against us, and if you're against us, we'll have your ass. And my argument was, well, I'm not going to agree with you simply because you're a foreigner. I think I've been here a bit longer than you have. And that brings me to another problem, is that people arrive in Africa, and after 2 weeks, they're old Africa hands, or they're Africanists, And what we know about the continent, whether we're white or black, actually doesn't matter. It's we don't know anything. They know everything. And I'm not being confrontational when I say it. This is what's happening. And until Africa gets to a point where we start taking responsibility and holding our leaders to account, this is going to carry on. We can't keep on doing this all the time. You can't keep on trying to fix the same bloody problem over and over, doing the wrong thing, but believing you'll get it right. It's costing more and more money, and it's costing more and more lives of people. And what it's doing is it's making the populace, the people, angry and upset because they're caught in this loop of expectation, false promises, broken promises, anger. And eventually that anger becomes armed anger. And when it becomes armed anger, we have a problem.
Eeben, you've mentioned more than once now that you've passed intelligence to some governments that you came across and stuff that you guys picked up on that was, for all practical purposes, blatantly ignored, and then now turned into a proper problem. Do you think sometimes in the context of Africa, as soon as it is not, I almost want to say from an internal source, or we did it ourselves, that some of these governments look at any help offered with skepticism or there's so much pride involved that they'll just ignore it for the sake of keeping face.
Or would it be on a different angle? Would it be them being complicit in not giving the information or the intelligence through?
You know, I want to tell you a little story. In Nigeria, I was invited to. Well, I wasn't invited. I invited a brigadier general to accompany me to somewhere. And that somewhere was to see some of my guys arriving in Nigeria. And initially he didn't want to. But later I convinced him and I said, you know, we are guests at your facility. It would be really good if you came. And now bear in mind, he's a Nigerian officer who is well aware of the anti-Nigerian sentiment in South Africa. Okay? So perhaps in his mind, I represent some of that anti-Nigerian sentiment. But eventually he said, okay, you'll come with me. You know, basically, I'll get this white man off my neck and I'll go with him. And like the guys are, when they get off the plane or when they get off a vehicle and they see me or they see each other or friends or whatever, invariably it's hugging and how are you and how's the family and, you know, we're looking forward to working here and that type of thing. And this guy was struck by what he just saw. And on the way back, he said to me, you know, I have a confession to make. And I said, what's that? And he said, I thought all South Africans were racists because a lot of our guys were black guys. So I said to him, you know, Brigadier, you have to be very careful of perceptions. Because before we got to Nigeria, we were told all Nigerians are criminals. And he burst out laughing and he said, yes, that's one of our big problems. we all live in perceptions because that shapes our realities. So, you know, the reality is we can fix these problems. Mozambique is fixable, but it needs political will and it needs military will. But you can have that will, but if you don't have the men and the equipment and the training and the leadership, it's not going to go anywhere. So I hope that answered that question, or maybe I got
you hit the nail on the head.
So let's move away from our problems a little bit. You mentioned that you stepped down. Did you step down from STEP? Wow.
I stepped down.
I stepped down from STEP. Yeah, my apologies. And what's next?
What's next for Eeben Barlow?
What's next for Eeben Barlow? Yeah.
I don't know. I had a very good time at STEP. You know, obviously I wasn't a director of the company. In other words, I didn't hold shares in the company. They were guys who asked me to chair their company. I did it on the condition that I didn't have shares in it. I think now it's time for someone else to take over. You know, number one. Number two, I think the company has made its mark for people. What I'm going to do next is always hard to predict. You know, my fate will guide me and time will tell. I've had some ideas. I've had some people already reach out to me, some governments, some private defense contractors have, since I posted that thing, already contacted me. I'll still decide what to do. What's on my plate right now is I have to finish this book. It's done, but it's now sorting out the photos, the typeset, the layout, etc. Then to be a final proofread, and then it goes to the printers. So there's still a lot to do in the coming weeks. Number two, I am asked to write a lot of papers for academic works or contribute chapters towards academic books, which I'm busy with. You know, I've toyed with the idea maybe it's time Executive Outcomes was pulled out of the cupboard and dusted off. But there's other things. And, you know, fate will guide me where I have to go. But what I do know is that there's still a lot of work in Africa. And I think, or I like to think, that I can still play a role in it. So that's probably what's next for me.
That's great. Well,
So no sleeping late and fishing.
yeah.
Well, I don't fish. I cannot play golf. I wish I could, and I wish I did. I'm allergic to fish, so there's no fun in going to catch a fish if I can't eat it. Because I was brought up, if you shoot an animal, you eat it. You don't just shoot it. So it's a little bit of a conscience problem I have. And then, secondly, I can't lie in bed all day long.
Yeah.
And there's only so much TV I can watch. So
no real retirement. Just new adventures. No real retirement, just new adventures.
No, I can't retire. Still too much to do and too little time.
So, Eeben, we're going to close off, but it was really entertaining, really insightful. You've actually given me quite a good angle on a lot of things that I did not understand completely. And like I said, it's very interesting. When Rowan approached you, I knew there was some forgiving or some misconception that we might be.
I had to take my foot out of my mouth. I will admit that.
But
like, can't help you.
Sorry, just say again, Eeben.
I interrupted Groby there. I said, well, if you can't get your foot out of your mouth, I'd help you to do it.
But I'm really happy because it lived up to precisely what I wanted it to be. And speaking for our listeners, I can see with all the comments, there's a lot of followers, a lot of supporters, and looking forward to your book. Yes, but thank you for the insight and taking the time to speaking with us. So simple as that. Thank you very much.
A great pleasure, and thank you very much for that. But I would like to leave you with one parting thought, and that is that whatever people might think of me in terms of good, to always remember I've had good men around me, and without them, I could never have done or achieved or made a success of what has been done. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that I will work with African troops any day of the week, and I'll go to war with them, knowing that they are there to do their jobs and they want to do those jobs.
Yeah.
But thanks very much.
Eeben, thank you very much. I'm going to ask you to stay on just for a moment. Guys, as usual, thank you very much to our producers, Renegade Media, Ramon Kabanak and his guys. Also, thank you to Paratus that always gives us a lot of support. I'm going to ask you guys that is listening, please go on over to the Paratus page. They are launching a campaign under the guidance of Dear South Africa about restructuring the firearms licensing in South Africa. Please go and give your support there. It's an important cause.
It's very important.
That's very important. Everyday Carry South Africa, Morna Els, Gareth Robb, you guys, Combative Concepts. Thanks very much for always supporting and sharing and taking part as always. Guys, and of course to the listeners, we had so many new guys this past couple of weeks. Welcome.
And ladies.
Thank you.
Ladies
and
well.
ladies. Yes, ladies. And all the guys that is sharing and asking questions. And we're very privileged. It's been almost a year now since me and Groby started the show. And it's been an absolute blessing. And we are thoroughly enjoying ourselves. And it wouldn't be possible without the viewers. So just a quick thank you from me.
Yeah, big thanks. And that's it. Have a good night. Have fun.
Guys,
and
thanks very much. And thank you.